lives to a day in Las Vegas. Bear with me. Our fortunes can change in a shuffling of the cards, with another roll of the dice, another spin of the wheel. Lives can turn on a dime. 1 minute you're riding high, the next you're penniless. If you can relate to any of these experiences, then you'll really connect with this week's chapter as Randy Frazee guides us through the story of Esther. Her story is all about taking chances, and she knows what it means to go big or go home. In Esther's story, we find ourselves in the 5th century BC, in Susa, which is the capital city of the Persian Empire. Judah was deported into exile a little over 100 years before this. And it was a move that was orchestrated by God as a loving discipline to Israel for their constant disobedience. After the 70 years, the Israelites were given the opportunity to return back home and to rebuild the temple. So about 50,000 of them went back to their homeland. The rest of the people, they had acclimated and they became integrated into the Persian culture. And so they decided they would stay. In our reading that we had this week, we find this multicultural dynamic going on in that lower story. If we look at Esther, we find that aside from her beauty, she had very little going for her, really. She was an orphan who was raised by her cousin Mordecai. They were a part of the few that had remained behind while the other Jews returned to Jerusalem. Now, at this time, living as a Jew in the Persian Empire was not very easy. In fact, there were risks of possible prejudice and, at worst, even death. King Xerxes, he was considered the most powerful man in the world at that time, and he was known for his extravagance and also for his recklessness. During the 3rd year of his reign, he decided to throw this huge party. It lasted for 7 days. This extravaganza showcased his vast wealth to all the military and civic leaders of his kingdom. And his kingdom stretched at that time from India all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. This party was an all-you-can-eat and all-you-can-drink gala, and it was held in the gardens of his palace. Now, after 7 days of partying, Xerxes decides he's going to send for his wife, King Vashti, to come and meet his guests, but she refused. The king's furious, and so he calls his advisors together, and they tell him that he needs to make an example out of his wife. If he didn't, all the wives of Persia would think it was all right to disrespect their husbands. And so he made this irrevocable decree, and he banished her from the palace. So long, Vashti. Time to look for a new wife. So Xerxes' aides scour the entire kingdom in search of women that were beautiful enough to suit his tastes. At that time, if you were young and beautiful and one of the aides chose you as the candidate, you had no say in the matter. You were carried off to a gentleman named Haggai. Haggai's job was to prepare all the women for the final selection process. What we have here is the very first episode of The Bachelor. Haggai was sort of a Tyra Banks and Simon Cowell rolled into a fairy godmother type who could make or break you on your way to becoming Persia's next top queen. this is exactly what happened to Esther. Now, her cousin Mordecai, he warned her not to reveal to anybody that she was a Jew. As Esther's only relative, Mordecai was a little overprotective, and he ends up hanging out around the palace every day to see how things are going for her. Well, Esther managed to hold her own among all the other candidates. They went through a 12-month queen in training program. It essentially was a beauty spa for them. They received oil of myrrh facials. They had deep tissue massages with aromatic lotions. There was perfume and cosmetic treatments. They had Pilates and yoga and nutritious meals specially formulated to enhance their physical beauty. Now, Haggai, who was in charge of the ladies, is so taken with Esther, they assigns her 7 female attendants, and he gives her the best apartment in the palace. After this 12 months of pampering and preparing, the candidates go before the king so he can choose the new queen. Now, as soon as he sees Esther, he knows that this is the one. He places the crown on her head, and he throws another extravagant party. And he declares that day to be a holiday throughout the kingdom. All these lower story events are combined together to be a Cinderella, Camelot, My Fair Lady, and Pretty Woman story, all combined into one epic tale. But the only thing is, we're about to see a dramatic upper story turn of events. Esther was in the right place at the right time for a reason that extends all the way to you and I. It is not by accident that this Jewish girl who is in exile now finds herself wearing a queen's crown. Shortly after Esther's coronation, Xerxes promotes one of his officials, Haman, to a prominent position over all the other royal aides. This status position required everyone to kneel before Haman. Well, Mordecai, he's still hanging out at the palace every day. He refuses to kneel to Haman. The other officials come, they urge Mordecai to comply to this decree, but he refuses, and he tells everybody there that I am a Jew. I will not bow. Infuriated by this news, Haman decides it's not going to be satisfying just to kill Mordecai for refusing to conform to these rules. So he asks permission from the king to have every Jew in Persia killed. Haman and his forces, they roll the dice to determine what day to carry out their plan. The time is determined to occur on Adar 13, around our calendar's February or March season. The decree goes out naming the day of the mass execution that was to occur. It would take place in 11 months from that day. Once the king had sealed the decree with his stamp, there was nothing that could repeal the order. When Mordecai hears of the decree, he begins to publicly mourn in front of the palace. Day after day, he marches in front of the palace wearing sackcloth and ashes. When Queen Esther's attendants tell her about her cousin, she sends them to find out why he is in so much distress. Up until now, Mordecai is the only one who knows that Esther is also a Jew. And so he sees an opportunity to possibly save their people. He tells her about Haman's plot to kill every Jew in the kingdom, and he begs her to approach the king and beg for mercy for her people. At this point, we have to look back and remember what happened to Queen Vashti. She refused to go before the king. Esther now feared that her attempt would be hopeless, because if you approached the king without him summoning you, you mysteriously vanished. But Mordecai, he had caught a glimpse of God's upper story. Suddenly for him, the answer to many questions became clear. Questions like, why had we remained behind in Babylon when all of our other Jewish friends went to Jerusalem? Why did Vashti refuse to go when the king summoned her? Why was Esther chosen to be among the candidates to become the new queen? Why did Haman have it in for all the Jews? So Mordecai replies to Esther as to why these events had come about with a question. He says to her, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Let me ask you, what would you do if you had to risk everything to accomplish the one reason you were placed on this earth? Well, Esther makes her decision, and she tells Mordecai, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And my attendants and I will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." After the 3 days, Esther goes and approaches the king, and instead of death, she's greeted with the king telling her that she can request anything, up to half of his kingdom, and he will give it to her. So she requests that the king and Haman come to a dinner that evening. And there that night she asks them to come again tomorrow night. On the second night, she exposes Haman's plan to the king to destroy her and her people, revealing for the very first time that she was also a Jew. Now the king is so upset by the news that he storms out of the room while Haman remains to beg for mercy from Esther. As he pleads for his life, he stumbles and he falls upon Esther just as the king comes back in. Seeing his beloved queen under Haman, he orders him put to death for attempted rape. King Xerxes then promotes Mordecai to replace Haman. With this turn of events, the king is still bound to that decree that he had about the upcoming attack on all the Jews. What to do? Well, with Mordecai now in this position of power, he goes and he asks the king, at least allow the Jews to defend themselves on Adar 13. Well, the day comes, and on that day, the non-Jewish people from all 120 provinces attacked the Jews. It became a bloodbath, with the Jews defeating 75,810 of their assailants that very day. The next day became a celebration that continues today and is called the Feast of Purim. It is celebrated every year on March 10th as a reminder that God's upper story is not ruled by chance, but it is his sovereign power. His reign is not limited only to Jerusalem, but it reaches everywhere that his people live. Now Esther, she could have ignored the pleas of her cousin. Life was comfortable in the palace. Why risk it all? If God wants to take care of it, let God do it. Why me? Each of us here we might never find ourselves in a position where we're like Esther and obeying God is a matter of life and death. At worst, if we're taking a stand for God, we might receive a little ridicule. People might think we're fanatics by demonstrating our beliefs. Our neighbors might become offended if we hold a backyard Bible school for a week during the summertime. Our co-workers and friends might call us Bible thumpers if we pull out our Bible to read it during our break time. But I believe that God still speaks to us in this quiet whisper, offering us the opportunity, like he offered to Esther, to save his people through some wild and crazy acts of loving obedience. Imagine the places that we could go and the things that we could do to reflect God's love to his children. Imagine what might happen in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, our nations, and even this world, if we had Esther's commitment. I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. Esther was willing to take a chance because she knew who was in control. I want you to listen to the words from King Solomon. He wrote, "We may roll the dice, but the Lord determines how they fall." Are you willing to make the same bet? Amen.